next talk in this session, we will have Jakub Mareček. We are very happy to have him here. So Jakub did his PhD at University of Nottingham, then spent time in several startups and was a researcher at IBM Research in Ireland, also spending some time at University of California at Los Angeles. Currently, he's a faculty at Czech Technical University, and he's done some very nice work in optimization, but also has been recently looking at biases in machine learning model. And he just received or recently received and is coordinating a large European project on that topic. So it's very exciting to have him here to tell us a bit more on the topic.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stage is yours.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for the invite. So this sits sort of uncomfortably in between the session we've had yesterday afternoon on the ethics and legal aspects of machine learning and the session which we've had this morning on the mathematics. Because in some ways in mathematics we often push towards solving problems which were well defined sort of 100 years ago, sort of such as optimization problems of various sorts. Whereas the sort of ethics and law sort of communities often focus on problems which they don't define very well. So here we try to sort of define some of those problems we've heard about yesterday formally, and then try to prove some theorems. I'll skim on the proofs, certainly, and actually on most of the theorems, but to sort of set this in context. So yesterday we've heard several talks about the regulation of AI, and especially the upcoming regulation of AI. But I think that it's good to sort of start with the sort of looking back. And the looking back really is that there are a lot of regulations which apply to AI already. And at least sort of going back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there are a lot of constraints on what the state can do in terms of the provision of the services of the state, and more recently, what businesses can do in terms of discriminating against some subgroups of citizens. So both in the US and in Europe, there is a long history of this civil rights legislation, which essentially is centered around two key concepts. One would be equal treatment, and one would be equal impact. And so sort of much of the talk is about equal treatment and equal impact, and about the actual sort of trade-offs you can strike between the two. It should be said that also sort of the subsequent years have brought regulation, and so sort of notably in Europe, some of the strictest regulation of AI which is already in force comes from GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which many of you are aware because you need to click on some sort of acknowledgement button in all kinds of forms. But essentially the GDPR, among others, sort of requires certain amount of explainability of algorithms processing personal data, bars profiling of individuals, and many other things. The upcoming regulation will be much more detailed, and in the European Commission, the approach to it is sometimes known as the risk-based approach. So what this means is that sort of there will be some applications where the uses of AI are forbidden. There will be some applications of AI where you can do whatever you like. And there will be some uses of AI which will be regulated, and that's where this talk focuses on. So sort of if you can see the small font, essentially anything related to consumer finance, anything related to HR automation, most of safety critical systems, much of biometric systems, and anything related to the administration of justice will be classed as these high-risk systems and will have special constraints put on them. And in the rest of the talk, I'll touch upon some of these examples of applications, and I'll try to explain what we think would be good definitions of the equal treatment and the equal impact, and how to prove that your algorithm actually satisfies those definitions. So the big picture is that somehow you have your AI system and you have many users, and after some time the output of the AI system leads to some actions by the users, and then you observe the actions of the users, or at least some aggregate change of state as a result of those actions, and you make use of this again in some subsequent retraining of the AI system. And in the grand scheme of things, we're essentially saying that the equal treatment is concerned with the single use of the AI system. And that's what sort of a 99% of the current work on fairness is about. And that maybe there is a sort of a, at least as important and interesting concern, which would be the equal impact, which would model the repeated interactions with this AI system. So for the equal treatment, I guess that you may have heard about the compass system. So it was mentioned briefly yesterday, but essentially in the US, many states, including the state of New York, the state of Florida, state of Michigan, and some others, use a system in the sentencing in courts that tries to forecast the time to reoffending. And it turns out that for the various ethnically defined subgroups or racially defined subgroups of the US population, the error in this forecast is very different. So when you look at the time of reoffending in reality and the time to reoffending in the forecast by the system, if you're an African American, you will have a substantial error in this forecast. And as you can imagine, this error is one-sided, right? So it overestimates the sort of propensity to crime for the African Americans, and it underestimates the time to the actual reoffending, and it underestimates the propensity to crime in the white Americans, right? So this is a particularly sort of a touchy example because it's genuine life-changing decision made by an AI system. Fortunately not in Europe yet, but maybe with some more regulation, such systems would be arriving in Europe too. And this is a subject of a substantial amount of literature. So sort of there would be maybe 500 plus papers which try to propose systems to deal with this sort of a compass time to reoffending problem. But our original contribution here is that we see it precisely as this forecasting system, whereas essentially the whole of the community sees this as a problem in classification, where they get 10 classes of risk and then assign this class in terms of the risk. And we have tried to model this as a linear dynamical system identification problem with some events. And we have shown that you can apply some hierarchies of convexifications and you can solve some regularized problems where you can guarantee that the error will be the same across many subgroups, for instance, ethnically defined subgroups. And so sort of we have this sort of two broad approaches, the one we took here, and which is I think a small minority, where we changed the objective function in the training problem. And then the sort of a majority as exhibited by many toolkits, including the IBM AI Fairness 360, where you essentially pre-process the data or reweight the data. And my claim is that sort of the reweighting or the pre-processing of the data is very difficult. Notably, when you have overlapping subgroups, there may not be any combination of weights which would be compatible with the sort of data you would have. So sort of in principle, we claim that the use of the regularizers is much more preferable as long as you can get global convergence guarantees for the algorithms we are using. And so far, we are using this in relatively limited cases where we have global convergence guarantees. But maybe, hopefully, eventually, we could make use of the material shown here in the morning by Jerome or some of our own work in this direction of proving global convergence for broader classes of functions we would be optimizing over, and that way making this sort of putting more terms into the objective approach feasible more broadly. So in terms of the actual results on the COMPASS dataset, this may be hard to read if you have seen this for the first time, but essentially this compares against about a dozen other methods proposed in the literature. So here this bottom plot shows that what we call AI Fairness 360 is the best method out of the many methods implemented in the AI Fairness Toolkit. And then these plots present a comparison of what we do using the regularized system identification methods against what the state of the art is. And the lower the better, and we're mostly lower. So that's a line of work which is joined with Bob Shorten, Chuan Zhou, Slava Kungurtsev, Fabio Vito Difonso, and many others. And we have some papers online if you want to know more. But for the second part of the talk, I would like to mention the equal impact. And I think that's much less studied, much less sort of up against the wall subject, and hence maybe more interesting. And so sort of in this picture of the closed loop view of the AI system, we would like to guarantee that the AI system across these repeated uses by the users has some nice properties, right? And I'll get to the nice properties shortly. And this is something we have been publishing a lot of papers on since maybe 2017. And the prototypical application to maybe keep in mind is from this paper, which is quite recent. And that's credit scoring, right? So when you have a bank, you would like to make credit decisions, right? And essentially, the bank currently uses some system of credit scoring and some affordability criteria. And we argue that those are not really independent, and that if you make the extreme case of this equal treatment happen, you could essentially say, I give the same credit limit to everyone. I give the same loan to everyone. But this wouldn't work, really, right? So if you give $1 million loan to a person who's making $20K a year, very likely they will default, right? And this can make them unhappy forever after. And if you give someone who's making multiple $1 million a year $1 million loan, that's okay, and they will repay that okay, hopefully, right? And so sort of what we are showing here is that sort of this equal impact could be looking at what happens if you ask for the loan repeatedly. So you don't ask for the loan once, but for instance, in terms of the credit card, you are asking for the loan effectively every month, right? So sort of the bank can increase your credit limit or it can decrease the credit limit, and you have this repeated interaction really sort of playing out quite vividly. And in this setting, our claim is that a good measure of the what happens sort of over the many interactions would be the average default rate across the subgroup, right? And if you would like to sort of see it that way, we would like to equalize across the many interactions with this AI system, sort of which does the credit scoring and the affordability checks, the default rates across the subgroups, right? And the banks are essentially based on sort of a risk assessment. So you have to sort of account with some risk of non-payment, because otherwise the risk-free assets wouldn't really have any, right? And so sort of essentially, there is a lot of mathematics which goes sort of between the pictures and what happens. But essentially what we are doing is that we model this as some nonlinear dynamical system with these users being represented by some probability functions which give you the responses based on what you have as the output at the time and some state, right? And you can then reason about these nonlinear dynamical systems under uncertainty using a concept which is sometimes known as the iterated random functions. The iterated random functions essentially are a lot like a fixed point, where you would apply the function repeatedly and you would study where you end up in those iterations, except you have many such functions and you sample those functions randomly. And the key result or criterion in the iterated random functions is that if you have contraction on average, you can get a unique invariant measure. And if you can get a unique invariant measure, you get the existence of certain limits, including some long-term averages of the allocations, or long-term averages of, in this case, the average default rate. So you can produce conditions on the AI system under which you can guarantee that you have this behavior in terms of the weak convergence to a unique invariant measure for the dynamical system. This has many applications. So the application we have just had published paper in Automatica on is related to load aggregation in power systems. So that's something people have been talking for a long while, but for the past 2 years you can actually get a Tesla virtual power plant if you live in California or Texas, and they are planning to roll this out sort of beyond. In California, about 1/4 of the regulated load would actually be down to some load ensembles like this, and in many countries such as Ireland and the UK, this is now being actively used to sort of manage the flexibility in the power systems. And so sort of on the technical side, the major difference here is that you have some very nonlinear filter, which is down to the losses in the power system, in the power transmission. And so here you can again model things somehow probabilistically, but now you have some iterated random function system, which has much more complicated sort of mathematical properties, because you no longer have this and this linear and stable, which made the earlier analysis easier. Another application for which we have a lot of these formal definitions and theorems and proofs relates to two-sided markets, and that's sort of some area where Jerome, as colleagues, have won Nobel Prizes, and where you may interact with those systems sort of on a daily basis in Airbnb or Uber without really knowing the mathematics behind that. But again, we are sort of showing how to set up the controllers in these cases of sort of much more complicated closed loops, where there would be one side of the closed loop sort of modeling the demand. So these could be customers seeking a ride, and one side of the market sort of modeling the supply. So these could be the drivers you would like to incentivize to get on the road, or maybe get off the roads if there are not enough customers. And so sort of the summary of the results in this direction is that actually there is nothing like a small gain theorem in this direction, because you need both this and this to be stable in order for the whole system to be stable. So we have studied many loops like these, and we have results. So this will be some of the few theorems here. But even for these sort of relatively complicated interconnections of these nonlinear systems under uncertainty, you can get theorems. They are easier when you don't consider the delays between the sort of sensing and the action of the control system and the actuation by the people. And they get more complicated when you consider the delays. But in all cases, they essentially suggest under what conditions you can show the unique invariant measure exists for the closed loop, which buys you all of these sort of nice things, such as every driver getting the same amount of jobs in expectation over the long run, which is certainly not the case. There are well-documented studies where sort of female drivers and minority drivers sort of do much worse than the white American drivers. And the final application I wanted to mention, a minute over time, is related to social sensing. So when you ask people to sort of tell you things and you base some decisions on the outcome. So this could be related to asking people about the state of the road congestion or about them sort of getting tested for COVID. But the general point is that it's hard in this case to assume that the closed loop stays constant, and because sort of the people change, their sort of status with respect to COVID changes, and their response rate changes, sort of for instance, day and night or such. And so in this paper, the motivation comes from the social sensing, but the technical results extend what we have been doing before in terms of allowing for some changes to the system. And then this gets even more difficult in terms of the analysis, but at least in the sense of some sort of a perturbation analysis in terms of showing that small changes to the parameters of the system won't lead to terrible changes in the unique invariant measure and will maintain its existence. That's something we have shown here. And I think that's sort of a fruitful direction for further research. And I should like to say that that's, again, sort of based on fantastic collaboration with authors in Dublin and London and Passau and Australia. And now we hope to do much more of the same in sort of a largish consortium, which includes CTU, NKUA, Technion, Athena, Imperial, IBM, Workable, and Data.io. And that's all I have. Thanks so much.
So on one of your slides, you mentioned you have people in the loop. Mm-hmm. Do you feel, what kind of model do you use for people, and do you feel, is it sufficient for people making decisions about? Or...
Well, that's a very good question. So what we essentially use for the decision making is that you get some state, and we look at the state and of the environment and the state of the person. And based on that, sort of usually the difference of the two or some function of the two, we have a probability function. And the probability function tells you if the difference is this much, the probability that the person does A or B or C or increases the something from A to B is this much, right? And this, in some ways, is quite generic as a model, But obviously, how to fit those models to the actual sort of a population is a sort of a big open question.
But do you fit them? Like, do you fit them to real data, or?
We have tried some of this, and for instance, in the transport engineering, this is actually like state of the art, and it's sort of covered by a stack full of manuals called the Highway Capacity Manual, and people would tell you how to do this. In many other fields, people don't have that sort of institutional sort of process for coming up with these models, and the model calibration is often done. For instance, eBay or such like, they would have quite detailed models, but it's not something which is available out there sort of for anyone to download and access.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions for Jakub? Please.
At the beginning of the talk, you talk about dividing people into subgroups. Is this algorithm as a bias towards specific, like the division of the subgroups? Is it like general, or do you decide in advance which subgroups you are divided people into?
Right, so sort of generally all of these algorithms are not aware of what subgroup you belong to. So those subgroups are based on what's called protected attributes, and sort of the algorithm wouldn't have access to the protected attributes. But in order to evaluate whether the algorithm is fair or not, you would like to sort of evaluate this with respect to some subgroups, and the subgroups come in the data, which in the case of the Compass data set were obtained using freedom of information sort of requests to the courts by ProPublica, by a sort of advocacy group. So sort of we generally receive this data. We don't use the data in the running of the algorithm. We use the data only to evaluate the fairness of the algorithm sort of post hoc.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank Jakub again for